Prefer to listen on the go? Find the audio version of Katie Prentiss' Sunshine Soul wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Katie Prentiss, and this is Sunshine Soul. I remember flying out of Portland one gray morning. It had been raining for days. That kind of heavy, wet Pacific Northwest gray that just seeps into your bones. I had the window seat on the plane like always. And as we ascended, I watched the droplets race across the glass. The clouds outside were so thick, like walls. And for a moment, it felt like the sun just didn't even exist anymore. And then we broke through. Probably my favorite moment. The clouds fell away, and there it was, blue sky, bright light, the sun just sitting there like it had been the whole time. And it hit me in that moment. The sun is always shining, even when we can't see it. Here at Sunshine Soul, we hope, we heal, and we love despite the clouds. We remember that there's light ahead. Welcome to Sunshine Soul. Let's keep looking for the light together. All right. We opened up a can of worms on the last episode. Maybe it didn't feel like that as much for you, but it did for me. And I will say there's so much more I could say about all of that. I think when we finished, I was just thinking about, oh my goodness, where do we want to deep dive into some of this? Let's talk more. But what we're going to talk about today is the specific experience that I've had as being the pastor's wife. Episode 6, The Pastor's Wife. Being married to a minister is such an interesting aspect to it. It's something that I will say, even though we found ourselves in ministry as a couple for a lot of years, starting with even just our years working in ministry on college campus and then becoming a college pastor at a large church in Alabama. We also worked as an associate pastor in California. I don't think I ever really felt like a pastor's wife, so to speak, until we moved to Portland. It's just such an interesting phenomenon that so few people would really understand. But let me try to illustrate some of my experiences in being married to a man that's a minister in evangelical faith. One of the first experiences I had was when we were coming up here to interview, and there was like a lunch that the elders of the church were trying to have, and Brian asked, could Katie come? And I think that they were thrown for a loop, and they said, oh, okay. I guess, yeah, we'll invite our wives. And then lo and behold, they uninvited me and like made it into an all men's thing again. And we were just super confused because we knew that the job was going to impact and involve our entire family. And so why was this like push-pull happening for us and for me in particular? I wasn't invited to the table. And yet when we got the job, one of the first questions I got from the administrator was, would you like an email address for the church email? And I was like, why would I want an email address? And he was like, I don't know. I mean, just if you wanted to have like an address with the church. And I'm like, well, are you giving me a paycheck? And he just started laughing. He was like such a good person. But I was like, of course I don't want an email address unless I'm getting paid, but I'd welcome a paycheck if you'd like to give me one. During our interview, I remember being okay, let me circle back. We interviewed at our church and we brought our entire family up here from California. We were without a job for a bit. We were looking for where we were going to land next. And this was a small evangelical church right in downtown Portland. And we come with our 4 very young children to this church service, and I'm looking for a pew large enough for all of us. And we find a section open in very front row of one of the side sections of the church. And when we sat down, I realized my mistake. I realized how visible we were in this pew. Everyone in the congregation was facing front, and this was more on the side of the church. So all of the people facing front could also see me sitting there with 4 young children. And I remember Brian being up there giving one of his first sermons at this church and thinking, like, how am I going to keep my children calm? The church that we had attended in California had this really robust, fun children's program where the kids didn't really have to sit there during the service for a large portion of it anyway. And they didn't have to sit still, and they had more age appropriate activities for them to do. And at this church, that wasn't the case. They were right there with me. And right in the middle of Brian's sermon, one of my kids, I won't name him, but one of my kids gets up from the very end of the pew and just stands up and walks to me at the end of the pew and whispers directly in my face, "Can I go to the bathroom?" Really loud. And I'm like, "Please go sit down." "Can I go to the bathroom?" And I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody's staring, whatever. I'm like, okay, go. And the whole time I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I know Brian is aware of what's happening right to the right of him. We see it above peripheral vision. I'm sure I saw him look over and be like, what is actually happening over there? And it's not that big of a deal. A kid needs to go to the bathroom, whatever, who cares? But I was so on display, and we needed a job, and I was trying to support Brian and not cause a ruckus or a scene. And here we were. So that happened. We got through it. It was fine. But in that moment, I realized, oh, wow. Doing this job puts me in the spotlight and our parenting and our children in the spotlight in a really profound way. And I remember making a commitment to myself in that moment of, I am not going to pressure these children to perform for anybody's expectations. And I think, as a mom, it's sometimes easier to have that clarity and those boundaries when it comes to our children. We can just say, we know we're not going to let someone cross them. We get that fierce protector energy that comes out. And that was super clear, super early on for me. That we were in a church that was pretty small. It had families with a few families with children older than us, a lot of families with children younger than ours, but not many with our kids' age. So there wasn't a lot for our kids at this church. And coming from a church where they had all their best friends and kids to play with all the time, it was a huge adjustment for them as well. And I felt protective. I also realized pretty early on that there was going to be really strong expectations for me. I remember thinking to Brian and feeling jealous. I remember telling him, I feel envious of you because you were hired by this church and you were given a job description. You know whether you're meeting it or not. You have clarity. You know what your work is. I'm like, I am not hired by this church. I do not have a job description. But yet, probably every single person in this congregation has expectations and ideas of what I should be doing and what kind of job I should be doing. I didn't like that. I didn't like feeling like there were these unspoken expectations of me left and right just because I was married to Brian. I'm like, I could be, the most industrious person. I could be the most professionally involved. I could be the most introverted, needing space to myself kind of person and still have the same expectations. It doesn't matter. Here I was, someone with a really strong ministry background, a lot of experience organizing people, leading small groups, speaking, all of these things. But I was not employed by this church. I was a mother of 4 young children. I was also self-employed with my own business. I had a lot going on. I in no way needed another job, especially not another job to work for free. I knew that much about myself. I also was struggling with a depression that I'd never experienced before in life when I moved to Portland. I was missing the home that I wanted to live in. I was missing the neighborhood that I had grown to love. I was missing the deep community that I'd had. I was feeling like a fish out of water in all of my communities in Portland. I couldn't find my people. I couldn't find my place to belong. And then I'd come to church and I felt like I was on display. I felt like everyone was watching too much. One of my first Sundays there, I was standing in a group of women talking as we do. There's probably at least 6 of us. Everyone's talking, sharing stories, whatever. And I remember speaking up and saying something just to contribute to the conversation. And it was the weirdest thing. I think people couldn't hear me or something, but I felt this moment of everyone leaned in and said, "What? What did she say?" And I had this visceral response of, "Oh, okay, come on, let's lean in and get this over with. I'm about to disappoint the heck out of you. So let's just lean in. Let's lean into that. Let me just go ahead and be myself. Let's get these ideas out of the way." So I struggled with that. I struggled with people being hyper curious of who I was because of Brian. I struggled with feeling like, oh, there's some people that want to be my friend because they want to be close to who Brian is and the leadership of this church. And it's like you can sense that energy pretty clearly. I was uncomfortable with that. I remember volunteering to speak at a women's retreat back in Georgia. And I was nervous and excited and that I had taken this role on. And I remember hearing that women were complaining and saying, "I wish she would do that for our church." And I'm just like, what? I can't just be a woman, doing something. So at this point in my journey, I was like, you know what? Here's how I'm going to navigate this. I'm going to do what I want to do as Katie, no matter who Brian is. I'm not going to take a role on just because the church is desperate and needs it. I'm not going to take a role on just because it's vacant and nobody else is stepping up. I will comfortably lean into small groups and things like that because I enjoy that, but I'm not going to do it because of who I'm married to. Whether people understood that or not, I had that boundary and that clarity with myself. And there are times where you have to let those positions linger. I realized, there's probably a reason why there's a stereotype about pastors' wives playing the piano or pastors' wives leading the children's ministry. And it's probably because nobody else would do it. I remember thinking, I'm glad I don't know how to play the piano. Our church had a really robust, beautiful music program, but I definitely, the children's ministry always needs work, but I was like, no, that's not my job. I have 4 kids. I want a break. So there's these positions, that are relegated to women, period. But then also as pastors' wives, people just expect you to take it on and don't give you any kind of clear job expectation. Because of my experience with the kids being on display that moment when Brian was interviewing, I remember thinking I'm not going to put pressure on my kids. I had grown up in this faith, in this evangelical faith, starting in Birmingham, this church that we worked in. I felt also like I didn't fit in there. I struggled with feeling like I fit in the South, period, because my family was originally from Ohio, and there's such this old heritage that exists in the South, and there is a air of exclusion to people that move there from other places. It's interesting. It's kind of just this old thread that's woven in the fabric down there, but in the church that we existed in there, it was very much culture and wealth and children dressed to the nines to go to church. And I remember feeling so much pressure that my kids fit in, that they had these pretty little smocked outfits. And it wasn't true to who I was, but I worked really hard to try to fit in, going to secondhand shops. And my mom would let me have money to buy the kids' church shoes and stuff. And even if I dressed my children with like normal clothes from like the Gap or something, they stood out like a sore thumb because they weren't as fancy as the other kids. It was crazy. But here we are, we're moving from California to Oregon. And I'm like, you know what? My kids are going to wear what they want to church because I don't think church is about what we wear. And I'm going to give them that freedom. And I'm like, it's hard enough to grow up with your dad being the pastor and everybody wanting to know you and have your attention. But that much more if you have pressure from like me or your dad to behave a certain way and dress a certain way and respond a certain way just because you're trying to jump through those hoops or please people. I want my kids to be kind. I want my kids to be curious. I want my kids to be respectful. I'm not negotiating any of those things, but I'm not also jumping through a hoop to make them be performative because we're in this church situation. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to help our kids have community in this church without like other kids their age being there. We brought a lot of their friends to church with them. My kids are dressing in their t-shirts or whatever they're wearing on a normal day-to-day basis. They might have dyed hair. They might have painted nails. They'd come in with their friends. They'd bring their skateboards and stick them under their pew. I think that they have good experiences from those years. And I really am glad that I had the wherewithal to be protective about our expectations and what they needed to do while they were there. But still, I'm feeling judgment. I'm still feeling like, I remember one time we were playing Katy Perry, oh my gosh, on the radio in our car in the church parking lot. And somebody made a judgment about, oh my God, I would never let my kids listen to that. I can't believe they're listening to that. And I'm like, you know what? We've got to let some steam off. Who cares? And so I was like beyond, I'm married to Brian. I'm without this job description, but still in this world of expectations. I'm also trying to parent and let my kids grow up and have questions and less pressure. Things with the church, for whatever reason, our experience of these years in this church was complex. There was a lot of conflict and there was a lot of struggle. There was definitely some really beautiful times as well, but some of the things were just like what I was talking about in an earlier episode with like the old guard and the fresh people trying to find answers and comfort and safety. I always wanted for me, myself, a faith experience in church to feel safe. I think people should feel safe to ask questions, to have curiosity, to not have the answers, to explore, to stay open. And there were a lot of people that felt that in our congregation, but still there was a lot of conflict. It felt like at every turn, Brian could not he could not win is how it felt. There were things where like on the leadership team of the session, there was somebody, like that didn't want him to be hired in the first place. So they made his life really difficult. There was a lot of conflict about direction, about where we should go, what we should think. And Brian found himself having to take so many punches left and right, people complaining, dissenting. It's not an easy job as a pastor. Brian was struggling. I found that, this man that I loved, he's such an introvert. He's so smart. He's curious. And he would come home just absolutely depleted. He would find like, he ended up like choosing to drink to have an escape and to have like a moment of ease in his day. And that became more and more ingrained. And ironically, in our particular evangelical culture, drinking is like super celebrated in I would say a very unhealthy way. A lot of the men that are in leadership will get together and just get super drunk while having meetings and stuff. And this was happening in his world as well. It was some sort of permission. And I feel like it was a Band-Aid and a safety net for him to like take the edge off. He'd go to meetings where he knew he was going to have really, really hard conversations, but there was also alcohol available. So he could dive in and ease the conversation and the confrontation with that. It was a lot. My job at that point became even more focused on him. I'm like, if I can support him and help him like feel comfort and ease at home for him to be able to go out and help people in this congregation. It's so fascinating to me to watch one person hold so much. You have this person who is trained in theology, not business, and not therapy. These pastors are asked to do so much. And especially in smaller congregations, there's less support. So Brian would be holding people's deepest pain, their darkest secrets, their horrible trauma, crisis. You can imagine, like you don't have to dig far at all into anyone's life that you know to realize there's real, true suffering and difficulty happening. And we're holding these things with so much compassion and love and care and trying to hold families up and couples and individuals up who are just devastated by things in their lives. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have somebody saying, you said the wrong thing. You said something that's not true. You don't hold the line. You don't cast enough vision. You're not this. You're not that. And, it's really a lot for someone to hold. But as a pastor's wife, I'm also trying to hold him and support our kids and create this like safety net for just our family to be together. There was this one time during conflict where one of the men on the session, which is the elder board of our church, wrote, I think it was a 10-page letter of all the things that Brian had done and was doing wrong. And we both were like, 10 pages? Like, oh my God. And we laughed. And Brian is so funny. He was like, he's reading. He's like, God, I don't even like myself either. Like, he's just reading and like, yeah, I don't like me. No, like I vote me out. Like, boo on me. But that is the kind of thing that we're sustaining. Like, that is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. Like, he'd come home and our conversations were turning entirely into church. It was, if it wasn't somebody's specific trauma and difficulty that we were trying to figure out how to navigate and support, it was conflict and crisis. It was, people that we loved. It was like leadership burnout, people who we loved and have been in it with us the whole time saying they needed to leave, which is just devastating. And you understand, but you're also like, no, not you. Right. And I mean, we had things like, we hired somebody to come work for us and we struggled with the finances to keep their salary intact. We gave up our retirement fund personally to support their salary. Like, these are the things that are unseen. They're hidden. We gave up parts of our salary to sustain them. And then when we figured when the church could no longer sustain their salary, they left and took half the congregation with them to start their own church. Whatever. All is fair in love and war, I guess. Like, now I don't care. But at that point, it's incredibly hurtful. It's like, oh my gosh. And I know that they felt hurt too. It's just, it's really complex and layered. Again, it's a business with no HR. It's a business with no business training. It's complicated. There were times in our lives where our values, like I shared before, my questions, my understanding of what I believe were expanding. I knew that there were people constantly being targeted and attacked by evangelicals in the church that should be protected and cared for. They were the marginalized among us. They were the people that like, there's no reason why we can't advocate for these things. But in our church, it was so specific. The rules that you had to say, the capital T truths that you had to say you believed, especially for Brian, well, really only for Brian, ironically, he had to say that he believed these things and didn't have any doubts about them, which is kind of ludicrous for a human being to like even say that, because we're all evolving and changing and curious. I mean, what is faith if it's not like taking a leap towards something we think? It's not science, you know? So Brian is ascribing to all these things and being held to a really high standard of what he's supposed to believe. I, meanwhile, am not. However, if I dissent or if I say anything against what he is supposed to believe, it causes trouble for him. He has enough trouble. You can see how it gets like really layered and complex, and how it feels like as a pastor's wife, your life might become smaller and contracted because there's not as much safety for you. There's not enough freedom for you. Even more so for Brian. I always grieved the fact that he couldn't explore his curiosity in a public way. He couldn't explore his intellect in a public way in this position because he would be crucified for it. And he was often if he just even asked a question, it would raise all sorts of conflict for him. I think it was when gay marriage first became legal, Brian said in our congregation, I think he said something along the lines of, some of us are really happy today. Some of us might be confused, you know, something along those lines. It did not go over well. There was people that left our congregation because he wouldn't say clearly that he was against gay marriage. Well, he wasn't, but he couldn't say that. And so there's so many things in our past like this that we had to hold closely. This is the way I think of it. Everyone gets super critical when people don't just like jump ship or like change direction. But when you are driving a cruise ship, it takes a really long time to turn that ship to a different direction. If you're in a motorboat by yourself, you can flip it around. But when you are the captain of a ship, it takes a minute to turn direction. And that's how it felt. It's like we can have patience and we can evolve. Eventually, Brian was able to get our church to change denominations. That was much more open and reflective of our values. And yet again, even in that, we lost so many people because there's just these fine lines, these capital T truths that people would not negotiate about. And it's really sad to me that we get so divisive, that we get so polarized when really we probably agree on so much in our lives. There was a church, there's a very culty church in Moscow, Idaho, that a lot of members that came to our church as what I would call refugees who were trying to heal from just the toxic culture, the black and white, the attacking nature of people who, you know, question or say they believe different things. There was a point after that incident in our church where that pastor wrote a couple different blog posts about Brian specifically. So now he's like getting publicly criticized by different people in evangelicalism. I'll say culty evangelicalism even, because I do not question that nature of this church. It's really sad when people are so stuck and ingrained in a small space that they have to question everyone outside of them and can't even interact without feeling fear. But anyways, they wrote a blog post and we were talking about it. Brian and I were talking about it together. And of course our kids caught wind, and our daughter was like, wait, what does it say? And we tried to like soften it. We're like, oh, this man was just saying some negative things about your dad. And she went upstairs to her room and wrote this pastor a letter that still makes us giggle to this day. She starts it with, "Dear poopy, 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 bad man," this guy. I'm not even going to say his name because I don't think he deserves attention. But it's still so funny to this day because I think that it shows not only the tension and conflict that we were dealing with as a couple, but also as a family, and how our kids, even though we think sometimes that the kids don't catch wind of it all, they do. And they feel defensive and protective, just like I do. Brian was a full human being and I was a full human being. And I don't think people often give space for that. It's like they need you to be something bigger than that. And it's nearly impossible to be. I always say that, like, in all of our experiences, I choose people. I love people. I want people to feel hope and healing. That has never changed for me. I'm no longer a pastor's wife, and you have no idea how grateful I am not to have to be introduced like that. One of the things that would always make me cringe and my back just tighten up is when people would say, "This is my pastor's wife." And I'm like, why? Why can't you just say, "This is Katie. She happens to be married to my pastor." I don't know if any other marital relationship gets introduced like that. Maybe if you're the partner of the president or something like that. But it was something that was always uncomfortable for me. It was one of the last things I would say about myself. And I am so thankful that I don't have to be introduced that way, that I can just be free to be me, and that Brian can be free to be him, and that the kids can be free to be themselves. And I hope you all can find that freedom as well. This episode was brought to you by yours truly, Katie Prentiss. Produced and edited by the fabulous Lindsay Guentzel. Our incredible Sunshine Soul theme music was created by the one and only Adam Sweeney. For more resources and transcripts, visit katieprentiss.com. That's Katie, Katie, Prentiss, Prentiss.com.